This morning's reading is taken from Genesis chapter 49, beginning at verse 29, reading through to the end of chapter 50. Then Jacob gave them these instructions: I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There, Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There, Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him for 70 days. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought, along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. and the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry up my bones up from this place." So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So we've arrived at the end of the beginning, at the end of our series in the book of Genesis, and we're going to find ourselves in the story by beginning with thinking about endings, discovering that endings are just the beginning and ending in the middle. Got that? Endings, beginnings, and then the middle. That's where we're going this morning. Our Bible reading this morning, which started at Genesis 49 verse 29, I do encourage you to get that up or open it if you've got a Bible with you. It begins with a very significant ending, the death of Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham and Sarah, the son of Isaac and Rebekah. He has his faults. Much of his life has been characterized by family conflict and deceit, but he's believed God's promises and known God's faithfulness. Jacob, who's now living in Egypt, he's been provided with property and in the best part of the land. He's been looked after by Joseph. He knows that his life is coming to an end, and he gives instructions to his sons that on his death, he is to be buried in the Promised Land, in the part of the Promised Land that the family legally own. And if you want to look up that reference, that's Genesis 23. So Jacob is in Egypt. He's coming towards the end of his life in Egypt, but he's given these instructions to be buried in the Promised Land, and that's significant. We'll discover more as we go on. And so, following Jacob's death, Joseph fulfills his father's request. But he does it in perhaps a slightly unexpected way. He follows Egyptian customs, so he asks for his father to be embalmed, and he mourns in an Egyptian way. But then, with Pharaoh's permission, he does what his father Jacob's asked for and journeys to the Promised Land to bury Jacob. So that's the first ending in our reading, Jacob reaching the end of his life. And there are a couple of things I think it's worth us noticing about that ending. The first thing I think is worth noticing is that despite Jacob's struggles, Jacob was held in kind of great honor, really, at the end of his life by the Egyptians. He's not an Egyptian, but he dies at the end of his life, and all the Egyptian dignitaries, all of Pharaoh's court, they mourned for him. They went with Joseph to the Promised Land to bury his father. This would not have been the ending that Jacob earlier in his life would have expected. I think that's worth noticing. So it's a kind of unexpected ending for Jacob, this great Egyptian honor that he receives at the end of his life. The second thing I think is interesting to notice about this ending is the lamenting and the mourning that happens. And the passage spends quite a lot of time telling us about the lamenting and the mourning following Jacob's death. Joseph grieved. The presence of grief didn't mean the absence of hope. And I think we need to notice that about this ending as well. I think sometimes we think, or we talk of endings in quite discrete terms, and actually often they're really complicated, and we have a whole mixture of emotions, and there's not a kind of moment in time. The ending's kind of, yes, there's Jacob's death, but then there's this period of mourning. So endings can be complicated. They can have a whole mix of emotions that can be held together. So there are two things I think it's useful for us to notice about this ending. The fact that it would have been an unexpected one for Jacob, and also that it wasn't a moment and then that was it. Actually, there's a whole mix of emotions. There was this period of mourning, of grief. So that's first ending. The second ending, there are three, by the way, just in case you're counting down. So 3 endings and 3 beginnings and 2 middles. The second ending is the ending of the brothers' fear and guilt interrupting God's good purposes. And just notice how I've expressed that. The ending of the brothers' fear and guilt interrupting God's good purposes. We don't know if the fear and guilt in and of itself is finished, but the ending is of that getting in the way of God's good purposes, that family politics being more important than God's good purposes. So let me explain what I mean. If you follow through the series, you will have heard in Genesis 45 how Joseph welcomed his brothers. They had sold him into slavery, but he welcomes them, he provides for them, and his actions really, I think he even hugs Benjamin, kisses Benjamin. His actions would suggest forgiveness, that he's forgiven his brothers. But now that their father Jacob has died, his brothers are a little bit nervous about it. So they think he might have forgiven them, but they're not quite sure. Maybe these kind of gestures of welcome and forgiveness, actually they were just because their father Jacob was still alive, and now that Jacob's died, maybe Joseph is going to kind of change his tune. Maybe his attitude to us is going to be different. So that's where the brothers are at, and in their kind of classic way of interacting, they send a message to Joseph saying that Jacob gave them this almost deathbed message to pass on to him. Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. That's in verses 16 and 17. Now, we're not told whether Jacob really said that, but the way it is expressed in the passage, it's kind of unlikely that he actually did leave that message with the brothers. But Joseph doesn't question whether his father actually said this. So it's probably unlikely that he did, but Joseph doesn't question that. And I think that's important that we observe that. He simply weeps and gives this rather cryptic reply. We're in verse 19. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And that could be, I don't want to forgive you, but I'm not God. That could be what he's trying to express. Or it could be a very lavish, gracious response where he genuinely is trying to express that actually he's not God. It's not for him to judge. And we don't know. I can't answer that for you this morning. So we don't know exactly what Joseph meant by that. But what we do know, let's think about what we do know. What we do know is that the brothers were consumed by guilt, but that the fulfillment of the dream is far more important to Joseph. They're the things we do know about the situation. Joseph's brothers have bowed down to him, if you were following in the passage. And what matters to Joseph most, what he's most concerned to highlight, what he's most concerned to dwell on, is not his brother's feelings of guilt, but the fact that God is clearly working out his plans and his purposes. Because what did Joseph see happening in the dream? He saw his brothers bowing down to him, and that's what's happened. And so Joseph's kind of not really offering a judgment on the brothers' guilt. He's not really engaging with that part of the interaction, because the focus for Joseph is on the fact that God's purposes, God's plans, the dream is being fulfilled. God is working out his plans in spite of human plans and wrongdoing. Evil human actions cannot defeat God's good purposes. Evil human actions cannot defeat God's good purposes. And I think when we watch the news, we need to hear that deep in our hearts. Even evil human actions and intentions cannot defeat God's good purposes. When Joseph says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Some of you may have thought of Romans 8, verse 28, for God meant it for good. Joseph is not necessarily suggesting that it was part of God's plan that his brothers sold him into slavery and treated him so badly. And I think that's really important that we hear too. Joseph isn't saying, actually, you intended to harm me, but actually God's planned for you to harm me so that God could work good. That's not what Joseph's saying. What Joseph is saying is, you had this harmful intention, but actually, even in spite of your mistreatment of me, God can work out his good purposes. And let's be really clear on that. I know in my own life, many of you have probably experienced it as well. People have told me of situations, oh, that's happening to you because God wants that to happen so that he can work out his good purposes. We don't get that from this passage in Scripture. Please hear that from me this morning. That's not what Joseph is saying. He's saying that actually God can work his good purposes out, even in spite of human failings. The focus is on the good. Joseph doesn't want his brother's guilt to be centre stage. He wants God's goodness to be centre stage. So that's the second ending. The third ending is the death of Joseph at the end of our passage. Joseph lived for most of his life in Egypt, and he's now died in Egypt. And we have that in verse 22 and verse 26. And yet the verses in the middle make it clear that Joseph saw himself as fully Israelite. He's held his great-grandchildren, that's verse 23, and he still trusts in God's promises that the Israelites will enter the promised land, and that's where their final resting place will be. So this kind of beginning in Egypt, Joseph's lived most of his life in Egypt, and this ending with the fact that his bones are in Egypt, he's buried in Egypt, that sits either side of a declaration that Joseph saw himself as fully Israelite. So let's just notice that. So three endings. Jacob's death, the end of the brother's guilt interrupting God's good purposes, and Joseph's death. And alongside these endings are three beginnings. Now the first beginning is the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promises. I wonder if you pick that up as we heard the passage read. Jacob's blessing, the honour that I mentioned earlier, that the Egyptians held him in. Jacob's family, he's the father of a large family. All of these things point to God's promise to Abraham beginning to be fulfilled. And similarly, when Joseph dies, whilst Joseph dies in Egypt, he dies having been used by God to bring blessing. And he gives instructions after his death, not just to his family, but to a nation. Did you notice that? He instructs the Israelites to take action after his death. He's given instructions not just to his family, but to a nation, to the Israelites. That's verse 25. So that's the first beginning, these signs of God's promise to Abraham beginning to be fulfilled. Jacob and Joseph, they've died in positions of status. They've died having received blessing and been a blessing. However, it's a beginning. It's a beginning because Joseph's bones and his family, his brothers, remain in Egypt. Genesis 50 is the end of a chapter, it's the end of a book in the Bible, but it is not the end of the story. It's not a picture of complete fulfillment. It's a beginning. So that's the first beginning. The second beginning I notice is the beginning of a new perspective. I wonder if you pick this up. The perspective that over and above all the human plans and struggles that we've heard about in Joseph's story is a powerful, faithful, good God. The ending of the brothers' fear and guilt interrupting God's purposes sits alongside the beginning of a new emphasis on God being at work and being at work to bring blessing and life and freedom. Joseph's understanding that God can bring blessing to others through something wrong that happened to him leads to a new, or at the very least, a renewed sense of vocation for Joseph. Joseph realizes he's called to be part of God's plan and God's working his purposes out through him. There's a real change in perspective that actually it's that shift that I talked about with the brothers' guilt isn't going to be center stage, God's goodness is going to be center stage. And Joseph is really articulating that calling here, the calling to be for blessing, the calling to be part of God working his purposes out. And the third beginning is the beginning of a new season of hoping and waiting. I think sometimes we kind of hear the word beginning, and beginnings perhaps it kind of feels quite positive. Actually, some beginnings are not always easy beginnings. The beginning that we've got at the end of Genesis 50 is the beginning of a new season of hoping and waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph has died waiting. The Israelites haven't entered the promised land, but he also dies hoping. He gives these instructions because he expects that it will happen. Both Jacob and Joseph had hope that God would fulfill his promises, but they were waiting for the time when that would happen. And so that's a kind of new beginning as we get to the end of Genesis 50, this hoping and waiting for God to fulfill his promises and the Israelites to enter the promised land. So we have three beginnings. The beginning of God's promises being fulfilled, the beginning of a new sense of perspective and vocation, and the beginning of a period of waiting and hoping. How might these things connect with our stories? Well, we all experience endings and beginnings in our lives. Each day we experience endings and beginnings. The end of a phone call. None of us stay on the phone indefinitely for the whole of our lives. It has an end. The beginning of a meal. And then there will be times in our lives when we experience significant, particularly significant endings or beginnings. A new job, we're at the start of the new academic year, a new school, a new college, a new home, the loss of a loved one or the birth or the adoption of a child, a friend moving away, changes in what we can do and our health. We all experience endings and beginnings. Now, I said at the beginning that we were going to end in the middle, and that's, I think, where we've got to. I'm getting myself confused with the tongue twister now. We've gone from the, we're in the middle. Because I think the endings and beginnings of the final part of Joseph's story remind us of two things. And the first is that our stories are in the middle of God's story. And the second is that God is in the middle of our story. If the context of Jacob and Joseph didn't make sense to you, or you remember nothing else this morning, I think those are the two things to remember from this reading. That our stories are in the middle of God's story, that God is in the middle of our stories. So firstly, that our stories are in the middle of God's story. What does that mean? What does that look like? God was working out his purposes through both Jacob and Joseph in spite of their human failings, neither of them were perfect people, in spite of their struggles, and in spite of the human schemes of others. And I wonder if we need to be reminded this morning that our stories, with whatever makes up our stories, there'll be times when we do and get things wrong, there will be times when wrong things happen to us, there will be times of struggle, that our stories are part of God's story. They're in the middle of pages of God's purpose for humankind. Whatever our stories, God can and does use us to bring blessing to others. That doesn't mean that everything happens for a reason. I've told you already, I really struggle theologically with the idea that God allows or causes everything that happens to us. But instead, it's a reminder that God's heart is for goodness and blessing, and we're called to be a part of that. Sometimes I think we live our stories over here and God's story is going on over there, and there are moments when our story connects with God's story, but it's a bit more like, I was going to say knitting, I don't knit, so I don't know if it is like knitting, you can decide. But actually, it's more like God's story is up here, and our story is just interwoven with God's story. We live under God's story all the time. I wonder if we just need to be reminded of that this morning, to reconnect that actually God's not doing his thing over here and we're not over here. Actually, God's over here and we're all under here. So that's the first thing I wonder if we might need to be reminded of, that God's heart is for goodness and blessing, and we're called to be a part of that. And that's, I think, challenging and exciting in equal measure. Do we need to hear that God can use us, that he doesn't just use others, he can use us. So often we put certain people or individuals or groups or churches on a pedestal and, oh, God's at work in that church, or God's at work in that person's life. Actually, no, God's at work in every single one of our lives and every single one of our churches. And so that's the first thing I wonder whether we might need to hear this morning. The second thing is more of a challenge. Perhaps we need to be challenged about what's centre stage. Maybe fear or guilt or frustration or bitterness are taking centre stage in our lives. And we need a renewed sense of perspective. We need to choose to say that actually what we want to be centre stage is God's good purposes. We need to be reminded that God's faithful and works through us. And actually we do have choices to make about whether we allow fear and guilt to stay in that centre place, or whether we choose to have a perspective where there'll be things we don't understand, there'll be things that we don't make sense, there are things that are really hard and costly to let go of. But we do have choices about whether we choose to allow God's goodness and blessing, the God of faithfulness, to be centre stage in our lives. To be reminded that God works in spite of wrong things that happen to us. And he works to bless and bring life and freedom. I know I was talking to someone the other day about how I often in my working life have to zoom in and then zoom out, and I consciously think about doing that. I think, oh, is this a zoom in situation or is this a zoom out situation? And I think we need to think in those kind of terms in our Christian lives too. There are times when we kind of need to zoom in, but then there are also times when we need to zoom out from a situation to God's big picture for humankind. No ending or beginning in our life is the actual beginning or end of the story. And I think that's helpful to realise. We need to be reassured that when endings and beginnings happen in our lives, and perhaps they don't happen in the way we want or expect or hope them to happen, our stories are held within God's bigger story. No ending in our lives is the final ending. Beginnings are often uncertain because none of them are the kind of first or ultimate beginning. Jacob and Joseph's stories didn't end with the fulfillment of God's promises. The story ends at chapter 50 unfinished. It's kind of quite an unsatisfactory ending. If it was a TV drama, I'd get to the end and be really disappointed, especially if they weren't making a next series. Fortunately for us, there is a next series. So perhaps we just need to be challenged by that, but also take some comfort in the fact that no ending in our life is the final ending. If it doesn't go exactly to plan, or it doesn't work out, or we feel like endings have happened and are a bit unfinished, actually that's okay, because God's story has the final ending. And if beginnings are just feeling very kind of uncertain, that's okay too, because we see in God's stories that the fulfillment of God's promises are gradual. So our stories are in the middle page of God's story, and that's demanding, requiring action, but also comforting and reassuring too. And secondly, God is in the middle of our stories. In both Jacob and Joseph's deaths, hope in God's promises is present. There may be lamenting, mourning, grief, but there is hope. I think I've said before, one of the great gifts of my Christian faith to me is how it helps me in a way that no other framework does, to be able to hold together things that don't perhaps feel like they really fit together. It helps me to hold things in tension. The presence of grief and despair sits alongside hope and faith. It doesn't mean the absence of hope and faith. Whatever any of us are experiencing or feeling this morning, there is always hope. Even if we can't see it, or even if we don't feel it. There's not a situation that God can't meet us in. If we'd just picked a random chapter of Genesis to read, so pick a number between 1 and 50, then we may well have read whatever passage we read and felt that God was not present. And that may have been how we felt, that God had forgotten Joseph or Jacob. And yet, reading to the end of chapter 50, we learn that Joseph had not been forgotten. Sometimes we just need to trust and wait until the end of the chapter or the end of the story. There is always hope. We couldn't necessarily see God at work in every single verse of 50 chapters of Genesis, but when we journey through the whole story and we arrive at the end, we can go, oh, God was there. God was working out his purposes and his plans. And sometimes that's how it is for our lives. So if you remember nothing else this morning, our stories are in the middle of God's story, and that demands something of us, but I think it's also reassuring too. And God's in the middle of our stories. Whatever any of us are experiencing, there's no situation where God's hope can't reach. Amen.